Hi, I'm Mike Keys. This is part two of my videos on how to convert an RK-R35 5-string banjo into a tenor banjo. Now in the first part we brutally took apart this RK-R35 and added a vintage neck, in this case an RB100 neck made out of maple. We used all the parts from the Recording King banjo, including the cheap tuners and the cheap tailpiece, just to show that it could be done. And now I'm going to show you some of the finer points of how to set up the banjo. Now there are a number of somewhat subtle but crucial points about setting up the banjo once you put the neck on. For one thing, the neck may not be properly set, had a proper angle. Now the books all for the 5-string, and I think this is true for tenor, all say about 3 degrees of angle break like this from the pot. It's practically imperceptible, but you can notice if you put it on a table. Now most of the vintage necks are at that angle relative to a Gibson style pot like this, but sometimes they're not, and if they're not, they need to be shimmed up, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. Fortunately for this neck, it worked perfectly for a 5/8 inch bridge, and I'm using one of my experimental bridges that I've built in the past. This one's made out of Purple Heart top and maple body, and it gave me a relatively nice action for Irish tenor banjo. You don't really have to have the super action. You just have to be playable, and because this is an older neck, it has a little bit more relief, which I can fix by unscrewing this little plate here and then cranking down very slightly on the truss rod that's in there. But I'm not going to do that right now, and it's probably not something you should do unless you feel comfortable with that sort of thing. Instead, what we're going to do is look at the things you have to do to make sure that the banjo is set up properly. Now in the other video, I showed you how I tighten the head, and in this case I tighten the head to a 91 on my drum dial. I kept calling it the dial drum, but it's a drum dial, which is a gauge that people use for drums. Now I don't particularly go to a number. What I do is make it sound good and then get the number so I can go back to that number later. But it turns out, as usual with Gibson banjos, the 90 to 91 is a pretty good number to have when you use these Remo style heads. Right now though, I'm going to show you what we have to do to make sure the banjo is ready to be set up. Now the first thing is to make sure that the strings are centered, and the way you do that is you look at the tailpiece. Now the tailpiece should be right between these two hooks here, and if it's not, and these cheap tailpieces often tend to drift a little bit, then you just have to put it back in, and then you tighten down on the nut that holds the tailpiece in, but you don't crank it down real hard, you just tighten it up. The second thing you do is to make sure that it is playable at this end, and this is where your luthier comes in and sets the nut for the larger strings. Now I happen to do that with these strings, as I put a set of when I first start out, I would put a set of standard jazz C level tenor banjo strings on, because that's the way the slots are cut. But I cut these slots for the GDA E strings, and in this case I'm using a set of octave mandolin strings that are bronze. Any strings will do to start out with setup, but you'll find favorite strings, you'll find a favorite pick, you'll find a favorite bridge at some point, and you may even want to change heads to a Renaissance head or another type of head to get the sound you prefer. But this is the tailpiece centered. The first video, we snugged this up to make sure that it contacts snugly and not super tight, but snugly. Everything else is set at neutral, and we're ready to go. So here I have not put the resonator on because we're going to mess around with various components here, and then you just have to take the resonator off to do that. So here's what it first sounds like. This is probably the most important thing you'll learn about setting up a banjo, and that's tightening the banjo head. Now in the first video I tightened it around from here to here, all the way around, very slightly, and it lucked into what I consider a fairly decent sound. If you want a little more bass, you can loosen the head. If you want a little more treble, you can tighten the head up a little bit. And the type of tone ring makes some difference in the tone. This is a flathead tone ring, which is a standard these days for these Gibson style pots. And I might add that Byron McKenna put one of those into his first Essex Paragon banjo. And some people don't like that sound, they like the archtop sound. You can get an archtop ring, but it's going to require some surgery on the rim here, and it's frankly then you may as well just buy a different banjo, because at that point you've lost the value, the price value of this particular setup. But that's one way of going around. The other way of going around is the same way an auto mechanic would put a header back on, and that's in the star position. In other words, you start with this nut, and then you go all the way across and tighten the other nut, so you're tightening at 180 degrees all the way around. Now I don't particularly like that method. For one thing, it probably doesn't make much difference, and the second one, I always forget where I am, and I screw things up, and I always manage to get things out of balance when I do it that way. So it's easier for me, once I've set it up, just to go around all the way around the rim, and just tightening it very slowly, then playing the instrument and seeing where it is. And you have to remember that it takes a while for everything to settle in. And some heads, like the Renaissance heads, take forever to stop stretching. So you go back a week later and you test it again, and you see if you like the sound, you look for loose nuts, etc. And at some point it will settle itself in, and then maybe 6 months to a year later you have to do it all over again because everything's loosened up. Now the innards of this particular style of banjo does look very complex, and as I pointed out before, all it does is hold the neck onto the rim, and it's this nut and this other coordinator rod are the things that hold the neck in. The rest of this is just for stability. Now, if you're really an aficionado of this sort of thing, and that's what the 5-string banjo guys are, you can tweak some of the pressures and stresses here to make the banjo sound exactly the way you want it. In the case of the 5-string banjo players, they all want to sound like Earl Scruggs, even though Earl Scruggs didn't sound like Earl Scruggs half the time. And it's an obsession with them. For Irish tenor banjo, it's not all that important. As long as everything is in neutral and snug, it's going to be all right. So I would suggest not messing around with this unless you have to take it apart, put a new neck on or something, and then you have to reset it. One of the last things I want to talk about is how to shim the neck. Now this is the original 5-string neck from the RK35-R35, and it was cut so that it's at a 3-degree angle to fit these pots. And this is all done by CNC machinery in China, and it's very, very accurate, and it works very well. But when you get one of these older necks, it may not be the right angle for you. If you have to have too high a bridge in order to get a good action, you need to shim it so that from the bottom up, so the neck goes like this. This is very much an exaggeration. If it's too low, you have to shim it from this side, and so it goes down a little bit more. So what you look at is these 2 lag bolts, and if it's too high, you shim the lower lag bolt, and I use veneer, but you can also use brass. If you use brass, thin brass piecing, which you can get at any hobby shop, until I get it right. It doesn't take very much to change the angle. What I do is with the veneer is I super glue it on one piece at a time, test it, try it again, super glue another piece on, test it until I get it what I want. And usually I'm looking for between an angle that'll fit either a 1/2 inch to a 3/4 inch bridge. That's quite a bit. So you have a lot of leeway with that. once you get that right, and because these pieces are super glued on, then you can just take the neck off with impunity and put it back on again, because normally it would stay that way. One last thing, I've put instructions on how to do this on my blog, but if you happen to get an old neck that doesn't have the right size hole for the Chinese tuners, what you have to do is ream them out and then drill them out. And that sounds a little bit daunting, that's because it is. But this is a plumber's reamer. You can get it at any hardware store. It usually has a handle that goes through there. And what I do is get the original neck like this, put the reamer in all the way up there, and you can see approximately where the reamer has to go to. And I would just put a piece of tape or magic marker or something there. Then you go to the old neck and very carefully just hand ream it out until you reach that point, turn it around and hand ream it again until it reaches that point. And what that'll do is that'll allow the tuner to fit in there, and then there'll be a little waste on the inside that has to be drilled out. So then you take your 3/8 inch drill and you put it into your hand drill, and you either do it by hand, or I find it a lot easier just to put my drill into reverse, which means it's just barely cutting, and just very gently push it in like this until it cleans it out. And then the tuners fit perfectly. Now you have to be very careful because you don't want to chip out things, even though you're going to be hiding them with the tuners. But once you do that, it's a good snug fit, then you won't have any problems at all with your tuners, except for the fact that they're cheap Chinese tuners that eventually blow up on you. But you can replace those later with a good set of go-tos. I hope these two videos have been helpful. I know I've been trying to figure out the best way to get a good, inexpensive banjo for students, and this seems to be the best way to do it for me. It requires a little bit of skill, and if you're unlucky, you might get a neck that isn't as good as you'd like to have. If you get this chance to see the necks, buy them. Look for the frets, make sure that they're intact. Look at the lag bolts and make sure that they're not bunged up. And if they are, you can replace them. They're not very expensive. You can get them all the parts from Stu Mac. And make sure that the truss rod nut is there, and hopefully the truss rod cover. But since they're one of the things that the 5-string guys like, they often take them away. You can get another. You can use the truss rod cover from the 5-string neck that you get from the RK35-R35. This is right now. There's one of these banjos is for sale for less than $600 on eBay. It's probably going to be gone by today, but you look around for bargains, you can find them. The necks you can get from a number of sources, such as Bernunzio's, Elder Instruments has them, First Quality certainly has them. I've got a few, and I think that it's a wonderful project. You come up with a great banjo. If you don't like it, it's worth its money in parts still, because parts as parts are still valuable, and I think you'll be very pleased with it.